Right, yeah, I can see people just coming in. So we'll kind of give it a couple of minutes, I think, because people are entering the waiting room as we speak, if that's okay. Perfect. Right, welcome again, everyone who's just joined. We're just giving it a minute or two because I know people are probably coming in from the plenary. So I'm just going to wait and see if anybody else is joining the call. Yeah, I've still got people coming in, so perfect. Sam, I'll keep an eye on the waiting room throughout as well, because there may well be people who sort of drop in, I guess, for specific papers, perhaps. So I'll just make sure I'll keep an eye on that as people present.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think to give it another minute, and then I think
and then we can make a start.
Yeah, just so we've got enough time for everyone. That would be good.
That's perfect. I think what I'm going to do is, if that's okay, can I put my overview slide up? How do I unshare someone else's? Stop. There we go. Right. So okay. Right, how's that? Can people see this? Yeah. Excellent. Okay, I think we're going to make a start because it's just gone 10 o'clock in the morning UK time here. So just very, very quick words of welcome here to this symposium titled A Multiplicity of Student Voices. So we'll be looking at intersectional I guess, perspectives in relation to the international student mobility experience. So my colleague Sam and myself are going to be convening the symposium, and we have what we think is quite an exciting lineup of 4 papers scheduled for you this morning. So just very quickly before I hand over to Fran, this is the running order. So we'll start with Fran, who is in Melbourne, Australia, and it's presumably relatively late over there already. So you can go first, followed by Susanna, who's in Portugal, colleagues at Manchester, and then Sam and myself, we're going to go last. Just a couple of really kind of I guess, polite points of etiquette. If we could ask everyone on the call to please save their questions until the Q&A and discussion part, just so we can collect everything at the end. And please hold off posting in the chat until then as well, if you could. It's just so that we don't distract any of our presenters as they speak. So we will pick up any questions, comments at the end of the symposium, if that's okay. So I hope that sounds sensible. So I'm going to stop sharing this. And then I think it's straight over to you, Fran, if you're happy to go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alina. And thank you, Alina and Sam, for inviting me to participate in this very exciting symposium that I think we're going to have. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people here in Naarm, also known as Melbourne, Australia. These are lands that were never ceded, and I'd like to extend my respect to the elders past and present of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and also to any other First Nations people who may be joining us today in this call. It's important for us to recognise here in Australia that this always was and is and always will be Aboriginal land. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you a PowerPoint, and I'll just do that now, and I'll begin my presentation properly. Here we are. So I'm speaking today on this topic of privileged mobilities and what I've called the complexities of class in Chinese women's international education projects. So what I really, just in a nutshell, what I hope to achieve in the next 15 minutes or so is a discussion of basically, we tend to think in Australia and other Western study destinations where international students from China go to study, we tend to think of these students broadly as privileged, as middle class, or even as wealthy students. I'm not going to be directly contesting that idea, but I do want to think about the complexities of what do we mean by the middle classes in the case of students from China, because it is in fact a complex question, and I'm going to be illustrating that with some very tiny kind of compressed case studies of some students that I got to know as part of a recent study. So let's just begin by thinking about what that study was. It's in fact a longitudinal ethnographic study which began in 2012 with a pilot phase which just involved 15 participants. The big chunky phase of my study is the one that resulted in the book that you see on screen here, which came out last year, Dreams of Flight. That was a major ethnographic study for 6 years or so, following 56 participants geographically from their pre-study lives in China to Melbourne, Australia, to other study destinations in Australia, and now on to their post-study destinations as well, largely in China and Australia. So it involved interviews, it involved what we call deep hanging out in ethnographic method, group activities, some digital ethnography, and me soliciting some cultural production from participants. The third phase, which is the one I'm involved in now, thanks to another research grant from the Australian Research Council, for which I'm very grateful, is allowing me to do follow-up interviews with those same participants, all the 35 of them who've agreed to still be involved in the project, for the next 3 years or so, 2 rounds of such interviews in Australia and in China. So what I'm presenting today draws partly on phase 2 and partly on phase 3 of the study, which is very much kind of embryonic at this point. But I'm beginning to think a little bit more about the material I'm getting in phase 3. So just to look at some contexts to begin with, I guess what I've got on the slide here, and you can find this, I'm going to go very quickly at this point because this is in the written version of the paper in the conference program. What you can see here is the broad context which has produced the final point under context here, that being this moment when sending children to study abroad has been for the past 10 plus years essentially an indicative marker of middle-class social status in urban China. Like, so common is the practice of sending children to a Western nation to study that it's almost like a hallmark of what you do when you're a middle-class family. For a range of reasons tied with the end of high socialism in '78, the market reforms, the rise of credentialism and a hyper-competitive education system leading to this situation. So in my study, I found that most participants' families, unsurprisingly, belonged to what we might call China's middle classes. So professional, entrepreneurial and managerial kinds of work. They were mainly from the wealthier large cities on the eastern seaboard of China, and also some from central and southwestern provinces. Some of the families were from smaller cities, but obviously most of the families, except one, which I'll speak about, had family money to privately fund the extremely high fees that Australian universities charge to international students, which are about 3 times as high as the fees to domestic students. So you can see in the final kind of point here, the different kinds of work that the parents worked in, from state and private enterprise work as managers and professionals, entrepreneurs. Some were working for government, and just a very few were non-professional employees. So these are some contexts. Now, this slide is simply a gratuitous collection of media representations of a common sort of stereotype that I think many of us may hold, not us here today, but like many people generally in the West may hold of who Chinese students are, right? They're as we see here, you know, rich Chinese students referred to here as shopping for luxury brands, you know, wearing a Gucci sweatshirt, living large in America, shopping at Tiffany's. Here's an article from the New Yorker about China's rich kids. So these are the most commonly seen representations of tertiary students from China in Western study destinations. But as I said, I want to complicate this image with some tiny stories from my field work, so we can just think a little bit more deeply about the complexity and the heterogeneity within the middle classes whose children go abroad for study. So I mean, even if we're not looking at students per se, even if we're just trying to think about the concept of what do we mean by the middle classes in China today, economists, sociologists, and other social scientists already have great debates and arguments about what middle class will mean in this context, whether it's a useful category given its heterogeneity and its proportional smallness, and in fact, paradoxically, slightly elite status within the broader masses of the population in China. So the notion of the middle classes in China is already contested, even before we think about students. But what I want to do here in this rather ugly table is to just speak through with you very quickly some very short snapshots of these 4 participants. So I'll look at them in turn very quickly. So if we think about the first participant here, Yue Ming, she's from a small city in Zhejiang province on the eastern seaboard, which is a wealthy area, but it is, when I say a small city, it's almost the place where she was born and which she thinks of as her hometown is sort of peri-rural. Her parents keep chickens and pigs. It's you know, it's a very small town. Later on, the family moved to an adjacent small city. So it's not a big place. If we think about her father's and her mother's background, Yue Ming, when I first met her, told me a very moving story of her father's life. He made his first money because he was born into, as we can see here, what is called peasant or nongmin, smallholding farmer status, which is a designation, an identity which one is born into and carries until it, you know, if you can change it, then that's good, as he did. But his first money he made selling cucumbers by the side of the road outside this village. He later, in the 1980s and 90s, was able to significantly advance his class position by studying in night school or technical college. He became a bridge engineer and made enough money to enter the middle classes. Yue Ming's mother, as you can see, her education level is also not high. She only finished middle school, not high school. And she was a non-professional employee in that she was a fortune teller and a feng shui expert, which essentially she did for enjoyment. They didn't need the money by that time. So Yue Ming went to a private middle school, thanks to her new class status, followed by then a public high school in her hometown, that small city. She came to Australia. She was not, at the time of her graduation from high school, she was not an academic high flyer. So she didn't get very high marks in the college entry exam, but her parents did have the money to send her to this low-ranked but high-cost undergraduate joint program between a university in Shanghai and one in Melbourne. And from there, as many students did, she kind of springboarded to a more prestigious university, a G8 university in Australia, to get her master's degree. So that's Yue Ming. If we look at Qin, who is like Yue Ming, we might say from a wealthy family, we can just see very quickly here that her family background is quite different. They're much more privileged, much more generational privilege. So her father was a government official. He had a bachelor's degree. Her mother was a medical doctor with a master's degree. She went to a private middle school and a key public high school, which is very difficult to get into and implies a certain amount of probably parental investment in training up for that to get into the key school. She went straight into a master's degree at a G8 university in Australia. Hong Hong is extremely different. She's the one who stands out from my cohort as really quite an outlier. She came from a mid-sized city in Shandong province, which is not a particularly wealthy province, even though it is in the east of China on the seaboard, a bit further north. Her father was a teacher, but he had retired. Hong Hong was a mature age student. She was about my age at the time. She was about 46 when she came to Australia to study a master's degree. So her father had already retired, but his education was high school level because it had been curtailed by the Cultural Revolution. So he hadn't been able to get more education than that at that time in probably the 1970s or 60s. Her mother didn't work, and she was also born into a peasant status, and her highest education was primary school. Hong Hong went to public schools only. In Australia, she found herself under such severe financial stress that in fact that contributed to a psychotic breakdown, which was very, very upsetting, obviously, for her and for me in the middle of the project, and extremely disruptive and difficult. Unfortunately, it meant that Hong Hong didn't complete her master's degree. She was sleeping in the street. She became vulnerable in that way that sufferers of mental illness sometimes do, unfortunately. And she was very disconnected from anyone in Melbourne. And she went back ultimately to Shandong without her degree being completed. I found out during the time that Hong Hong was ill that she was in fact self-funded, that she had taken out loans from people she knew in China, and she was desperately working in those sort of neck and shoulder massage places in shopping centres while she was studying, trying to get money to repay the loans. So she was under a whole series of pressures. Another pressure that she was under was that she had brought her 2 young children with her. She was married. She brought her 2 sons, but then she found out they couldn't go to school in Australia because it would cost too much. So she had to send them back to China. So then she missed them. And so you can see this kind of compounding pressures of the care work, the financial situation, and the health status of Hong Hong, leading to her not completing her studies. Finally, Xiaoxing, we could say, like Hong Hong, is probably a lower middle class participant. She was from a small town in Guangdong province, close to Guangzhou, but operating like a small town rather than part of a big city. Her parents ran a printing press in the local market. There was physical labor. They were physically printing things in the wet market there. But Xiaoxing, so Xiaoxing, like two of the others, like Yueming and Hong Hong, was first in family to have higher education. She was a very diligent student, and she'd done well, as you can see here, before she came to Australia. In Australia, she was a little bit like Yueming. She came into a joint program, a slightly more prestigious one with higher marks, and similarly springboarded to a G8 university for her master's degree. So, I mean, I know that was very rushed, but that gives you hopefully some sense of the complexity and heterogeneity of these 4 young women's stories. So we might say that Yueming and Qin, you know, at first glance, we might say, well, they're both from wealthy families. But if we think about the very different class histories within the family, the different routes to wealth, their contrasting cultural educational capital in the families, and indeed the contrasting habitus of the daughters, and knowing them both quite well, they were completely different in manner, in the kind of just their way of being in the world. You know, if we take all this into account, we see the heterogeneity even in that category of wealthy, right? Similarly with Hong Hong and Xiaoxing, both of them we could call lower middle class, both first in family, but significant distinctions between them again in Hong Hong's extremely difficult circumstances in a number of intersecting factors versus Xiaoxing's situation, which was a little easier, well, quite a lot easier for her. And they had, of course, very different education outcomes insofar as Xiaoxing successfully finished her degree and Hong Hong did not. So just very quickly, and I'm seeing that I'm almost out of time, what happened next? I think if we look at the aspirations that these participants told me about back in 2015 versus the outcomes, we start to see the way that social class really is playing a major role in whether those aspirations can be realized and how easily and how much. So in Yueming's case, she thought she wanted to work as a teacher initially when I spoke to her. In 2023, she'd actually, in a sense, gone in terms of prestige and income above that. She was working in a professional job related to her studies in accounting in Australia, in Hangzhou, a very wealthy city on the eastern seaboard near her hometown. Qin, very smooth. She wanted to go back to her hometown in Shanghai and find corporate employment in her field of study. That's exactly what she did. She's working in a foreign enterprise there now. Hong Hong didn't know what she wanted to do. She was going to take her chances, see where the best chance was, possibly stay, possibly return. As we know, she returned without a degree, and she's gone back to staying at home with her family or with her son, looking after her sons and her husband. Xiaoxing wanted to return to China and work in a foreign enterprise, but in the event, her parents turned out not to be keen on that. They thought it was more respectable for a young woman to remain in the hometown, not to go to Shenzhen, where she wanted to go, not even to go to nearby Guangzhou, but to stay literally in the neighborhood where their family home was. So she did that. She joined the Communist Party of China, which was always a dream of her and her family, that somebody could join the party. And she followed essentially pressure from her parents, particularly her father, to work in a neighborhood government organization, which is what she's doing now. So not a foreign enterprise. And it seems that there was something of the lower middle class or more traditional style habitus there in shaping her mobility decisions after graduation. So in conclusion, just back to the points I was raising at the beginning, I think we need to be very wary about characterizing Chinese students abroad as simply wealthy or even as simply middle class, because of their heterogeneous backgrounds and experiences in terms of the levels of wealth they or their families may have, their family class histories, which can be wildly different, right? From people with parents who were born as peasants and are now middle class to those with major inherited wealth. Family cultural and educational capitals and habitus thereby being different, and therefore life opportunities also being quite different within the cohort. So that social class as a combination of all of these intersecting things, it seems, at least from this tiny sample I've given you today, that social class may be a key factor in determining how likely it is that these women's post-graduation aspirations for career and future mobility can in fact be realized. So I've focused on social class. As you can probably tell from the way I've described the study, I was mainly and largely looking at gender in the main body of the study, but today I've wanted to focus on the class dimension. But of course, those two things intersect as well in very interesting ways that I don't have time to speak about. Thank you. I'm done.
Thanks very much, Fran. Really, really interesting study. Could I ask if anybody has questions for Fran specifically, could you just make a note of those, and we'll come back to your questions and your comments later on in the question and answer discussion part, if that's okay. Great. So I'll hand over now to Susana in Portugal, who will be talking to us about her research. You're on mute still, Susana.
Sorry for this. Let me just share the screen. Can you see it?
Yes, if you make it full screen, it's there. But... yeah, perfect.
Okay. So good morning to all of you. I'm Susana from the University of Aveiro, which is located in the northern of Portugal. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this symposium, Elena and Samantha, for inviting me to taking part of it. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. Today, I will address the perspectives of international doctoral students attending the University of Aveiro on the qualities of supervisors. So first, I will tell you a little bit about the multifaceted roles and needed qualities as shown in literature. Then I will address the concept of intercultural doctoral supervision. I'll present you the study and the main results, and then we can discuss this. So, as we know, doctoral supervision has been a focus of a great amount of research in the past decades, and this is being attached a central role in students' doctoral experiences and is being perceived as a demanding task. Well, studies highlight supervisors' roles as mentors, coaches, advisors, experts, managers, facilitators, critical friends, career guides, counsel as well. And this, within this, they have to assume multiple roles. And well, grounded on supervisors and candidates' perspectives, research has been drawing links between supervision and students' progression and degree completion rates, satisfaction, career development, inclusion in the research community. So all of this emphasizes doctoral supervision as a very complex task, which requires a set of disciplinary and transversal qualities. So over the last 3 decades, studies in different contexts and using diverse methodologies have shown that person-related human qualities in doctoral research supervision acquire great importance for doctoral students. Among this, we find interpersonal and interpersonal competences such as personal support, empathy, patience, kindness, accessibility, flexibility. Within interpersonal competences, we find communication skills, whether verbal, spoken or written, timely and clear feedback provision have also been identified as key qualities, including intercultural competence. Well, overall, research has been showing that interpersonal and intrapersonal skills are the most valued by doctoral students. But then we also have digital skills, research skills, management skills, and discipline specific knowledge. But the question that I'm posing in my research is, what about research dealing specifically with the qualities for supervising international doctoral students? Nevertheless, and although a growing body of research focuses on international doctoral students, mainly on the challenges and difficulties they face in their doctoral experience, research dealing specifically with the qualities for supervising these students is still scarce, and in Portugal it is almost inexistent. The general qualities that I've told you about and that appear in the literature seem adequate to supervising IDS, but as we know, supervisors are central figures in international doctoral student journeys, and my research has shown me that there are some qualities which are really related to this condition of being foreign students. So I suppose that you have all heard about this concept, intercultural doctoral supervision. In the past 15 years, there's been a flourishment in the literature on this concept. The main cause for this is the increasing number of international doctoral students in many regions of the world, and indeed the impact of globalization and aggressive marketing by universities in many countries has increased the flow of international or culturally diverse students enrolling in doctoral programs outside their own countries. So intercultural doctoral supervision has been defined as a social and relational space where different cultures meet and where supervisors acknowledge students' prior intellectual, cultural, and personal histories. In this line of thought, Bell perceives it as a complex art of encouraging students to incorporate their own cultural knowledges that adapts to their cultural interaction styles, that acknowledges the places they came from. And as Shu and Grant underline, this is a zone of mutual learning in which student and supervisor keep exchanging the role of supervising and scaffolding, and the supervisory relationship becomes more dynamic and reciprocal. Well, these conceptualizations of intercultural doctoral supervision are based on an ethno-relative perspective focused on developing mutual, transcultural, transformative learning, which arises from the encounter of different knowledge, skills, and values within what Robinson Pant calls of a dialogic space. So the emphasis is on the acknowledgement of the cultural knowledge and the intellectual resources that students bring to host universities as central features of effective supervision. Well, this perspective considers that dialogic interaction between supervisors and intercultural doctoral students provides distinctive opportunities for both to learn from each other. And so, as Grant and Manatunga put it, intercultural doctoral supervision can be a pedagogical side of each possibility. The recruitment of international students has become an important part, an important aspect of Portuguese higher education over the last decade. And so there has been an investment on which is related to different factors. For instance, we have very pessimistic demographic projections and a declining pool of national candidates. We are also struggling with public funding cuts for higher education following the 2009 economic crisis that we are still dealing with. And also the Ministry for Higher Education has put forward a strategy for internationalization, which puts the emphasis on the attraction of international students. So students from Portuguese-speaking countries have been the traditional public of Portuguese higher education institutions. And currently, they still represent about 2/3 of international students. Portugal is also becoming more appealing for students, for instance, from Spain, France, Italy, and Germany, some of which have large Portuguese communities, also from China and Iran. And this diversification of international students in Portugal is reflecting global shifts in the traditional flows of international mobile students. So among students from Portuguese-speaking countries, the number of Brazilian students has grown very significantly in the last decade, and especially in the past 4 years, when the numbers doubled. Some come from a massive migration of Brazilians to Portugal. We have more Brazilians living in Portugal, and this is seen in the residence permits that have been growing very fast since 2019. But specifically at the doctorate level, we can see that there has been an increase. So in 2021, a total of about 22,000 students were enrolled in doctoral Portuguese, in doctoral studies at Portuguese higher education institutions, and almost 8,000 were international. Of this, 67% come from mainly Brazil, Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde. So against this background and this contextual synthesis, this study, the study that I've been conducting, in this case, and what I'm going to present with you today, is that I wanted to understand the perspectives of international doctoral students from the CPLP, so from the community of Portuguese language countries, Brazil, Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, who attend a PhD program in education at my university, regarding the qualities of a good supervisor. The context, so, is the University of Aveiro. We have 51 PhD programs, about 1,733 students enrolled in doctoral program, and as you can see, more than 50% come from Portuguese-speaking countries. So I led semi-structured interviews with 11 students. 6 came from Angola, 3 from Brazil, 1 from East Timor, and 1 from Mozambique, and they were aged between 33 and 60 years old. So they had very diverse mother tongues. 5 had Portuguese as their mother tongue, then 2 Kimbundu, 1 Nyunge, 1 Umbundu, 1 Kikongo, and 1 Indonesian. So what have I concluded from these interviews? Well, all IDS find interpersonal qualities as the most relevant. And within this, Haidt emphasized the need for supervisors to know their origin contexts. Specifically, the characteristics of educational systems, which is obviously related to the fact that these students attend a PhD program in education, and most of them intend to contribute to the improvement of teaching and learning processes in their institutions and countries. So, in this sense, these students value supervisors' previous professional experiences, as we have these 2 examples. So my co-supervisor has been in Angola, he knows Angola very well, he knows the context very well, or as this example from a Mozambican student. Then In addition to knowledge regarding origin contexts, these students also emphasize the importance of supervisors acknowledging the influence of the origin context and their cultural, linguistic, educational, professional, and personal backgrounds in research development. More precisely, they refer to the need for supervisors to acknowledge that they have diverse learning backgrounds and are used to different teaching and learning methodologies. Sometimes this leads to some misunderstandings between students and supervisors, as you can see in this example. They also appreciate supervisors' ability to acknowledge the research and knowledge cultures they bring to their studies, namely regarding the construction of theoretical frameworks and research tools. Then they also underline the importance of supervisors' knowledge regarding their linguistic backgrounds. As I told you, some of them do not have Portuguese as their mother tongue, and so this brings several issues as to thesis writing, and they emphasize this, that it's really difficult because speaking Portuguese and writing in Portuguese is quite different. We also I also have examples that show that languages intervene in doctoral research activities, for instance, in the construction of data collection instruments to be applied when they are building their questionnaires, their interviews, whatever. There are always some mismatches because sometimes supervisors are not quite aware of the context and how to build those instruments, sorry. Then we also have the need for supervisors to be flexible regarding the variety of Portuguese they speak. So they report difficulties in written and oral interaction with their supervisors. They underline social linguistic, syntax, phonology, and prosody differences between the varieties of Portuguese. And as I told you, sometimes this results in very hard misunderstandings and distress, which affect the supervisory relationship. Well, then they also underline the need for availability and commitment, especially when we think that these students are away from their homes, from their families. They also value the interpersonal community qualities as to the ability to provide personal and emotional support, a need related to the fact that, well, they are foreign students and they are away from their families, from their institutions. And then they emphasize empathy, so the need for supervisors to be empathetic, motivators, leading them in their journey. So I think I have 1 minute only, so I'll pass this. They also underline academic and research qualities as regarding to theoretical and methodological knowledge. And they also say that in spite of all of this, they also want their supervisors to be demanding and to instigate them to be critical and to be rigorous. So this data, and I'm sorry for being so speedy, I didn't mean to, but what I understand from this is that supervising international doctoral students requires a few things. For instance, the need for institutional reflection and discussion on intercultural dimension of doctoral research and supervision, because Portuguese universities have been receiving all these international doctoral students, but supervisors do not feel sometimes competent to supervise across languages and cultures. It's important to discuss the representation, in this case, of linguistic and cultural heterogeneity as a deficit, because we demand our international students from Brazil, Angola, Mozambique to write in Portuguese, in European Portuguese. Well, this has changed, and we can just discuss this later. It is also important then to discuss the imposition of language standards and the perception of European Portuguese as a default referent. And more importantly, I think that it's important to provide supervisors with training opportunities as to intercultural competence development, intercultural teaching, and supervising competence. And this has to englobe not only supervisors, but also other teachers, students, the services, and the management of the university. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for taking Alina and Samantha 3 minutes. Sorry.
You didn't, Susanna. It was great. Thank you so much. And it's so lovely to hear from a context that is so under-researched, and from, hear about the experiences of a group of students that we don't hear much about, I think, certainly in the sort of English language international student literature. So thanks for that. And again, can I just please remind everyone on the call, if you have questions for Susanna specifically, keep hold of them, and we will come back to those at the end when we have our discussion. So next, I'll be handing over to our colleagues in Manchester. So Sylvie, Ray, et al., over to you, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm just going to start my timer so I can keep track. We looked at a pilot project, and our very ambitious and overwhelming perhaps goal is to look at how we can start globalizing widening participation. I'm here with my colleagues today, Tom Donai, who is our school lead for widening participation, Ray He, who is researcher in international higher education, Sarah McQuarrie, who is school lead for academic advising and student well-being. So together we occupy a context in the Manchester Institute of Education, which is highly internationalized, particularly at the postgraduate taught level. And with the concerns that Fran has so beautifully illustrated earlier, we're aware that the institutional and kind of sector level perceptions of international students, specifically Chinese, but not exclusively, really do stereotype as wealthy. To give you a bit of the context within the UK, widening participation is a very UK-centric concept. We are aware of that. It's a regulatory requirement that British universities show how they are attempting to overcome educational disadvantage. So this relates to other concepts globally, like affirmative action in the US. But in the UK, it's operationalized in key metrics that are really UK specific and nationally bound, which reflects a lot of the thinking around equity in global higher education. Stuart Tannock put it best when he said, concerns about educational equity stop at the border. So the mandated reporting within the UK, which determines data collection, is essentially limited to home students only. So what we were trying to do with this pilot research project is to try to understand, if we were to try to globalize widening participation, to globalize concerns for equity and extend it beyond the national borders, how would we go about doing this? And could we use existing widening participation criteria? Otherwise, we would not know empirically who is excluded from international higher education. Just for a bit of reference, international students are not even asked widening participation questions through admissions processes, so there's no data institutionally or nationally. The question we were trying to answer is, would these questions even be relevant given global differences in education and higher education access dynamics worldwide? So I'm going to hand over to Tom Donay now, who's going to explain a little bit about what these criteria look like in the UK context.
Thanks, Sylvie. Okay, so based on the Office for Students criteria for WP, you'll see from the list here that we have a very sort of broad range of ascriptions and characteristics here. This makes sort of working with WP problematic at times. But the Office for Students define WP students as those who are from areas of lower higher education participation, low household income, and low socioeconomic status. In addition, some but not all Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students fall under the WP category, as do mature students, disabled students, and care leavers or care experienced students. We'll come to those later. In addition, students who are carers or who are estranged from their families are also considered WP students, as are refugees. There are two further categories who I'll talk about shortly. That's children from military backgrounds who we omitted from this study, and people or students from Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities also omitted from this study. Within our pilot study, there were time limits in place, and to support the project resources, two specific groups, those I've just mentioned, were excluded from the pilot. Our longer term plans are to support these groups and to ensure conversations and insights are drawn from these groups to help explore their experiences and achieve a shared basis of understanding suited to WP. I'll move on then, Sylvie.
Hello, and when we're thinking about this pilot study, we're interested in how we got the data that we're just about to report on. So within that, we invited all possible international students from across the University of Manchester. So we are a very large campus and we have a very large student body. And within that, we used two different sampling techniques. So that's called a maximum variation sampling technique, where we're interested in getting a breadth of different individuals with a breadth of different experiences. And by adopting a multi-method technique, so that's the focus group and interviews, we're also able to get varying depth of information and kind of explore more and more of these criteria and categories as well. To support any kind of ethical concerns and support the ethical process, we had a strict kind of set up eligibility process to do a various number of checks beforehand, as well as a familiarisation exercise at the start of these qualitative data collection opportunities. So I'll pass to Ray now.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to share some of our findings from this pilot study, and this is to say kind of like bubble circles to illustrate our findings, as you can see from the level of the darkness of the colors. So on the top level, so refugees, low household income, low socioeconomic status, minority ethnic groups, and also disabled students. These are more commonly understood ones. I'm going to explain that later. And then areas of low higher education participation and mature students are less commonly understood. The three left, people estranged from their families, caregivers are the most confusing ones. I'll explain them in more detail in the next slide. Sylvie, please. Okay, so well, before that, actually the widening participation, this term itself is not quite familiar with our participants, other than their kind of like a general UK higher education experience, but they can also be able to guess the meaning and relate the definition to the home context to some extent. So these five terms have been commonly understood. So low household income is widely understood, but somehow this technical definition is a bit disputed, and we got a possible alternative suggested by some of our participants as a less privileged one. And low socioeconomic status is another commonly understood and easily guess the meaning from the term itself. Refugees is another widely understood one, but there are some discussion in our data collection about the boundary between undocumented illegal immigration and refugees. Disability is commonly understood in the sense of physical disability, while minority ethnic groups are commonly understand around the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students. Sylvie. Thank you. The most confusing ones around the tensions, misunderstandings, and uncertainties are around the rest of the terms. So disabled students, we mentioned about that, widely understood in the sense of physical disability, but mental disabilities being included was not that problematic. And actually students require more expanded notions of disability, for example, the learning disabilities and neurodiversity, and some had learned in the UK this mental health issues, mental disability issues in their higher education experience in the UK, but they also reported it was not commonly considered in their home countries. Another one is a student from low socioeconomic status, as we indicated, is somehow commonly understood. However, the parental occupation was not widely understood as an indicator for socioeconomic status. But the socioeconomic status itself was relatable as social class. And the people estranged from their families, this is a quite confusing one, and most had not considered as a factor for educational inequality. And this term carries some stigma around this term. And the minority ethnic groups, as we mentioned, widely understood around some Black, Asian minority ethnic groups, but it could also be disadvantaged around the lots of national variations in terms of who is included and which minorities are disadvantaged. So some discussion around that as well. Mature students, another quite confusing one, as mixed understanding. Some people can guess from the term itself, but some people also, participants get confused, taking it mean to like a personal characteristics, but age, older students, or easily understand relating to widening participation. And some students suggest potential alternatives as adults or non-traditional students instead of mature students. And carers and caregivers are the most confusing one, sometimes mixing between each other. So the carers got some mixed understanding as well. So definition helped clarify what does it mean for many participants, but still the ambiguity remained, and this term was seen as too simple around the relationships included. Do we mean friends? Do we mean children? And it was not clear for all. So there are some potential linguistic misunderstanding around it, and some potential suggestion could be like a caretaker or caregiver or the head of household. And household is a term we use widely in the context of China or Asian countries. Caregivers, another quite confusing one, is not widely understood until the definition was given. And also the state-run foster care system was not a familiar background for most of our participants, if not all. And the last one is about the students from areas of low higher education participation. It's again mixed understanding, but quite confusing. It's somehow understood it, have made some guess initially, but the definition definitely made clear as it around the regional inequalities were common and related to different contexts. And we have a lot of discussion about the different provinces in China or different regional areas in different countries. So that's some brief picture of our findings. I'll hand it over to Sylvie.
So I think one of the things that is challenging about the research design of this approach is that just because something is not commonly understood or is not widely recognized by our participants, that doesn't mean it's not an issue. So just to take that out of all my double negatives, it is entirely possible that, for example, questions of care leavers may have never occurred to our participants because they've never encountered any in higher education. So in a way, those topics which are the least well recognized, I would argue, are likely to be potentially the most problematic or the most marginalized and disadvantaged groups in higher education. So what can we take away from this? As we suspected, we were really confirming a suspicion with this study, but the UK-centric widening participation criteria really don't work for international students. Which means that if we want to collect data about international students and commit on an institutional and a sector level to fostering equity, we can't use existing institutional data collection instruments. We don't really have any context-specific inclusivity-focused policies and practices that would support this. If you think about the level of detail that Fran provided earlier about her the heterogeneity in her sample, that's a beautiful illustration of why we need that inclusivity-focused approach. For our admissions officers at the moment, at least at an institution the size and scale of Manchester, that isn't available, it's not operationalized for international students. So the tailored and nuanced understanding that we would need in order to foster equity in international admissions and student support and pedagogy is simply missing. So because the widening participation is really a political object that's driven by the wider national higher education agendas, it's going to be very challenging to shift the narrative. So the big takeaway we hope from today is to keep asking why internationalization and widening participation are kept separate. We all know the answer. It's about money, but we need to keep asking the awkward question and highlighting that it is deeply inequitable, and we cannot pretend to keep committing to, for example, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which embed a commitment to equitable, high-quality higher education, if we are not looking at the intersections of internationalization, international student recruitment, and equity in access to and admissions in higher education. So I'm going to pass over the final hand over to Sarah.
Thank you. I think we've had a really good summary there of the kind of content. What I think we would need to point out here is that this addressing inequity is something that we all have an interest in, and thank you for coming to listen for those kind of points. What we want to do is build up a network. We want to have people who've got insights and involvement and achieve that both at a local and also a much broader than just a kind of national, local viewpoint. So we really want people's perspectives. We want to get others involved. We really want to see these considerations mapped out onto other areas as well. So when we're thinking about these aims and the work that we have achieved and work that's continuing and going, and when we're thinking about ensuring that every learner has the equivalent set of rights and access to support, please get in touch, please get involved. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Oh, thank you very much, colleagues. That was fantastic. You're getting lots of claps as well. Fab. So I think we've only got one paper left now, which is mine and Sam's. So again, just to remind everyone, anyone who's got questions or comments for Sylvie, Ray, Tom, and Sarah, just please, save them until the very end. We'll have plenty of time. So Sam and I will aim to keep it quite succinct, so we've got plenty of time for questions and discussions. So Sam, I'll go ahead and share our slides. Bear with me. Can you see those? Yeah, great. Okay, so I think a lot of the issues we're going to cover have already been captured by colleagues really, really nicely. So Sam and I are going to report on a qualitative study exploring the experiences of international students from the Global South in the UK. I should say who we are as well. So Sam and I, we're both based at Newcastle University in the School of Education, Communication and Language Sciences in two different academic departments. So I'm based within Applied Linguistics on an intercultural communication program, and Sam is based in our education department. And we've basically joined forces because I've been for a number of years now researching the international student experience, whereas Sam has been researching the home student experience with a particular focus on social class. And we just thought that makes for a really interesting combination. So this is where we're coming from. So in terms of what we're going to talk about, we're just going to give you a little bit of an overview of our project, a brief rationale. We'll briefly deconstruct how we operationalize the Global South in our research, tell you something about the methodology and participants, and then just a little flavor of some of our key findings and some implications. So just to give you a little bit of background, really when Sam and I came together, what we wanted to do is explore some of the structural inequalities that international students from the Global South might face in the UK. We got a little bit of funding from our faculty, which we're very grateful for, and that funded a mixed methods project over the last 18 months or so. So today we are reporting on the qualitative part of the study. We have also recently published earlier this year an article that reported on our quantitative survey data. So you can read that if you're interested. So the overarching research question for our project was this one here. So we were interested really in how gender and socioeconomic background affect international students' identities, how they experience university life, and also how they understand mobility. We focused specifically on international students from the Global South studying in the UK, because of course there have been many, many studies on international students in the UK, but we found, looking at the literature, that quite often there wasn't really necessarily a distinction being made between those students. So they were sort of lumped together in a way, or seen as a kind of a collective group. And as we've just heard over the last hour, international students are, very, very, stratified in so many ways, very, very diverse. We've also already heard by everyone on the call here, really, that international students tend to be still conceptualized as privileged, and international student mobility is also seen as a bit of an elite endeavor. Of course, there has now been a more critical shift in the literature. I think we all know that, and authors increasingly calling for viewing the international student experience as multidimensional and stratified. We also then know, if we just look at global developments, that actually more and more international students seek mobility from a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds. So one example here is just the predictions regarding international student mobility, outward mobility from sub-Saharan Africa, for example, which is projected to grow. So this is just a little bit of background and where we came from in terms of our rationale. Now, Global South, I mean, I think we could have a whole symposium on this. We won't go into too much detail, but we've looked, of course, at a range of different definitions, and it's entirely obvious to us that there are many ways of conceptualizing this. We needed something to work with. So, obviously we knew that it refers, vaguely to relations of power. It refers to colonial histories and so on. We used the Group of 77, which is basically a sort of proxy for Global South countries that United Nations have, which we found quite helpful, because we had to somehow, of course, say what we meant when we recruited participants, say what we meant by the Global South. We let people self-identify, but we gave them this kind of proxy because we needed something to work with. What we also knew from looking at the literature was that international students from the Global South were likely to be affected by pre-existing inequalities. So some example of this, for instance, are some studies suggest that students from the Global South are more likely to undertake paid employment alongside their studies, quite often in precarious jobs, and also simply the status of the country of origin or perceptions around some of these countries. So we just felt that this would be an extremely interesting group to research. So this qualitative strand of our project that we're reporting on today used a narrative inquiry approach. So we were really interested in the students' stories. We conducted semi-structured interviews with 12 international students, but we're only reporting on 9 students here today. And this is because we also had some students in our sample who were not studying in the UK, but in other really interesting contexts, which we'll report on another time. So the data we're talking you through now came from 9 international students, 6 females and 3 males. We used a thematic analysis approach to look at the interviewed data. Here we were particularly interested in what we termed intersectional consciousness. So we wanted to really know, in the participant stories, was there any evidence of them really being aware of their own intersectionality, how their different dimensions of identities intersected, and so on. So we looked at things like what were their understandings of some of the challenges, but also the opportunities related to their multiple identities, and how that might impact their educational experiences of studying in the UK. I should also say they studied at different UK institutions, so not just Newcastle University. So we really tried to get a bit of a spread across different UK institutions, as well as different levels of study. So you can see them here in this table. So these are our 9 interviewees that we're reporting on now. And you can see we have all the levels of study here: undergraduate, postgraduate taught, as well as doctoral studies, and countries of origin. So you can see here, these are some of the Global South countries. We did include China in that as well, because based on the proxy we used for Global South, China is indeed included. There are, of course, complexities around the Global South, in that many countries who are supposedly classed as being in the Global South are in the Northern Hemisphere. I think you all know that. So it is complex, but these were the participants that we had in this study. So I'll hand over to Sam now, I think, to talk us through some of the key findings.
Thanks, Alina. So as Alina said, we tried to use an intersectional approach because we wanted to recognise those multiple forms of inequality. We also were aware that often gendered dimensions of international student mobility narratives aren't always highlighted. And intersectional analysis is often particularly underutilised in studies looking at men. In terms of the women in our study, we felt there was particularly a clash of some of those imagined future identities of sort of financial independent career women with sort of that sense of maybe those more naturalized aspects of femininity relating to sort of a home life and domesticity. So we felt that some of our findings were certainly challenging some of those post-feminist discourses that we tend to hear. In terms of the men in our study, we felt that the concept of hybrid masculinity was quite helpful because actually it was helping us to understand some of their experiences in terms of looking after their families in relation to quite a caring masculinity, but also tempering that with those sort of hegemonic pressures that they were sort of under pressure to fulfill in terms of the role of a breadwinner. We also felt that there were some issues around economic precarity, which obviously Alina's highlighted is already in the literature. For our students that were receiving scholarships, often that funding was quite insufficient to meet living costs. That sort of pressure to engage in paid employment, and obviously those sort of socioeconomic factors then really having a bearing on the way our participants were engaging in their studies in terms of how they were managing their time. And then finally, in terms of familial commitments, only a few of our students had brought their families to the UK. The majority were involved in transnational caring, but clearly that included both emotional and financial support. We'll go over to the next slide, Alina. Thank you. So picking back up on that theme of sort of transnational caring, there was a real sense of that sort of financial and emotional strain in relation to either caring for their own offspring or perhaps elderly parents. So it was quite a sense of a conflicting role between that of a parent or carer and a student. We do know that some research has highlighted transnational mothering, but we felt that less was known about international students, male international students, in terms of their caring commitments. Certainly the domestic UK home literature tends to focus on mature women student parents. So again, just a group that we don't often really recognise, and therefore perhaps our support systems at universities are perhaps somewhat lacking for that particular group of students. Next slide, Alina, thank you. Yeah, so just picking up again on this issue around economic precarity. Obviously, do read the quotes, but actually we just really wanted to emphasise that really, paid employment really resulted in quite significant time pressures in terms of being able to study. So obviously sort of really impacting on their academic work, and absolutely just this sense of either needing to top up scholarship funding to manage the cost of living in the UK, or to actually send remittances home. Next slide, Alina. Yeah, so just picking up on gender a little bit again, I think we sort of found some quite interesting variations between men and women as international students. I think overall we really got a sense that actually that narrative of international students engaging in transnational caregiving, really calls into question that construction of students being quite carefree. We did know that particularly for our male students, albeit, you know, obviously a very small sample, that sort of culturally dominant hegemonic masculinity around sort of, you know, paid employment was really quite strong, and actually put quite significant pressures on their opportunities to engage fully in their study. And for our women students who didn't actually have children, they were actually under enormous pressure to actually sort of, you know, settle down, a lot of anxiety about, you know, how long, you know, that their doctorates were going to take and when they were going to return home, when were they going to have their own families. So we felt that whilst to some extent that overseas study acted as sort of as a mean of sort of, you know, temporary freedom from conformity pressures, actually for the women who were from more patriarchal societies, there was still that enormous sense of conformity that was sort of expected in terms of their future decision making, in terms of careers and balancing that with potential families. Can I have the next slide, Alina? Oh, we're doing well. So in terms of just conclusions and implications, and I think probably, you know, again, picking up on, you know, many of the things that we've already heard today, you know, we can query whether actually universities, you know, have actually, you know, recognise this group of students in terms of, you know, as Sylvia Tallev talks about, in terms of a sense of widening participation. And we would equally challenge that and say, you know, to what extent are institutions cognizant with the varied backgrounds of their students. We felt in terms of international experiences, you know, they are still very highly contingent on these non-academic issues, particularly around transnational caring and you know, economic pressures. We're also, you know, quite concerned, a bit like Campbell and Neff, about actually, you know, what are, you know, the outcomes, a bit like Fran highlighted, you know, with a really sad example of her participant not being able to continue studying partially because of financial pressures. We do worry about actually, you know, there's longer term pressures that, you know, the number of issues that our students are facing is likely to impact in terms of programme outcomes. And then obviously, you know, we've just picked up a very small amount of our qualitative data, but what we really hoped, you know, we just really want to raise awareness, you know, sort of amplify these voices. Really having that sense of, you know, taking forward a greater understanding to institutions, really so that support and wellbeing services are tailored more effectively to encompass a wider range of backgrounds and experiences, which shape enjoyment and engagement with academic study for all our students. And I think we've just got a few references at the end. Thanks, Nate. Oh, wow, the time has just gone off. Perfect.
Thank you, Sam. So we sort of just whizzed through it because we really wanted to make sure we've got a little bit of time for questions, comments and discussions. And I think that's fine. We've got, you know, more or less 20 minutes now. So what I would suggest, so Sam and I have had a little chat before how we might want to do this bit now. So first of all, obviously, big thank you to all of our presenters. I think we've covered a real range of different aspects of this, but also lots of common themes. So what Sam and I are going to do is we will give the floor over to everyone on the call first, see if we've got questions, comments from the audience, or even, you know, for each other as presenters. And then if we have time, Sam and I can maybe pull out some key themes. And we've done our homework a little bit in advance, looking at your abstracts, but also I've made some notes. So we'll do that, I think, at the end, if that's okay, Sam. But I think we'll just open it up now for questions. So obviously very happy for anybody to also just post in the chat if you feel more comfortable with that. We can pick that up. I think something's already been posted there, or also just, you know, raise your real hand or your virtual hand if you have any comments, questions. So over to everyone, really. I'll give you all a chance to kind of digest. So we've got Pam who's on the call. You've got your hand up.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you everybody for a really interesting morning. I just wanted to, I'm one of the leaders of the Postgraduate Interest Network. One of my colleagues, Julie Reeves, and another colleague, Dawn Duke, have been busy working across projects in Africa to support doctoral students. And they've become increasingly aware of not just misunderstandings, but not being at all aware of the constructs that other people have about things. So I've written a little bit there in the chat, but just to introduce you to that and to say, please, if you're interested in engaging with us sometime around Easter, we're planning a postgraduate network event looking at how we all have alternative constructions of reality, especially different epistemologies about what research is and how it should be done, then please join us, please get in touch. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Pam. That's great to hear. Fantastic. Right. Did anybody else have, I'm just making sure because I can't see everyone on the screen, see that anyone's got their hands up. We've got something in the chat, I think, from Fabian asking a question. I can read it out, or if you want to unmute and ask it yourself. So the question is, did students participating in any of the studies express a sense of awareness of the revenue generating aspect of international students for universities and found these at odds or affecting the perception of their own personal challenges? Really interesting question. So thank you for that. So I don't know if any of our co-symposium presenters want to answer. Fran?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Fabienne. Absolutely. Look, there's a huge awareness of the revenue generating raison d'etre of international students in Australian higher education among the students themselves, both domestic and international. I mean, because it couldn't be more obvious, the economic logic that underlies their appearance in our higher education sector. And there have been large media debates about kind of Chinese students in particular, as they often get called cash cows, which is meant to be a critical term about, you know, the way that the public, as in the government system, has been defunded by the federal government and therefore is reliant on private fee income. But that term can also end up sounding a little bit derogatory towards the students themselves, who after all are obviously not cows, they're people. So yeah, I mean, the Chinese students were very much aware of that, and some were in my sample were very like concerned about being seen as one. Actually, Chin, who I told you about, the wealthy and the one with a wealthy family history, said, you know, they think we're rich and stupid, right? Rich and dumb. That's the stereotype, which we see in the media stuff, but it also relates to their role in the higher education funding ecosystem, if you like, because it's well known that they've been courted for the money that they bring. So yeah, I mean, I think that introduces a kind of, not necessarily always a kind of cynicism, but I mean, it's not a very good footing on which to think about the relationship between oneself as an international student and the host country, because it does look cynical. And I was just thinking, I mean, just to kind of segue from Fabienne's question there a little bit, and I know other people probably want to respond to that question too, but it seems to me it's sparking off thoughts in my mind about the paper from Sylvie, Ray, Thomas and Sarah as well, about essentially as you said, Sylvie, it's very clearly like competing logics. Because if we're thinking about equity and widening participation and increasing equality in higher ed, that's a set of ethical considerations. Of course, the reason that isn't easily extended beyond the domestic student pool is because as soon as we're talking about international students, we're talking about an economic rationality, no longer an ethical rationality. And you pointed out that contradiction, but I mean, that's just a big part of the problem that I think we're all kind of thinking about in our different ways in this panel. And I've wondered about it a lot myself, and I have absolutely no idea how to challenge it, because it's just so entrenched in the Australian case anyway, that this is why the students are here. Sure, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, perhaps caricaturing the position, but we all know why they're here. We know what we need from them, which is a boost to the economy and a boost to the sector, and anything we can give them in terms of well-being or welfare is kind of like almost extra. So I have no answers, but I love the way you put that question. Thanks.
Thanks, Fran. Did any of the other presenters want to comment on that one or respond to that particular point or question?
Well, I can, if you...
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I could also see this in my sample. Mainly, what these students, these international doctoral students told me about this is that, well, we pay a very high fee because international students' fees are higher at Portuguese universities than national ones, which is, I don't know, which is something we have to think about. And many of them told me that, well, if teachers and supervisors knew how much we pay, the availability, the commitment would be different. If they know about all the personal sacrifices we make to be here, because we are talking about students from Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, Brazilian. Well, it's very, very, very difficult for them to live on the scholarships they get from their funding from their countries of origin, as Alina and Sam told. So this also happens here. It's not sufficient, but they know that the income they bring to the university is very high. So they, for instance, Brazilian students who are more and more at Portuguese universities, at my university, they were obliged to write the thesis in European Portuguese, as I told you at the presentation. Now imagine that you have to write your thesis in a variety of English or Portuguese or Spanish that you do not know. This poses questions, very hard and difficult questions to deal with. So they made a huge pressure over the rectory, okay, of the management bodies, and they managed to be able to write the thesis in Brazilian Portuguese. And one of the things they said to support this was that, well, we pay a huge fee to attend this PhD program. We pay more than Portuguese students, and we have the right to ask for this. And the pressure was so strong that the rectory had to say, okay, you can write your thesis in Brazilian Portuguese, for instance. So they are very aware of the revenue generating aspect in this context, yes.
Thanks, Susanna. I mean, it really seems that this transcends the national contexts, doesn't it? I mean, in the UK, obviously, I think, you know, Sam and I, we found it very much in our data, didn't we? I'm just thinking of the one student from Singapore who sort of said something along the lines of, oh, you know, if you come from a place like Singapore, you're automatically assumed to be basically wealthy. But then actually, I think quite often there was a sense of, well, we don't come with the full package necessarily. So we need to actually supplement our scholarships, as you've said, Susanna, as well, you know, with paid employment and so on. So I think, yeah, I think that's definitely something that resonates with us, doesn't it, Sam? And Fran's posted a comment in the chat as well. Don't know if you wanted to just say something, Fran, on that, or if we just read. No, that's great. Yeah.
I think as well, we really found that, you know, without wanting to get into the politics, various things sort of happened in UK higher education over the last 2 or 3 years, which haven't always resulted in the best experience for the students, and sort of students sort of saying, actually, you know, we're paying so much money, and actually therefore, you know, but actually a very tactful, diplomatic way, saying actually we're a little bit disappointed because actually, you know, we haven't had the experience that we hoped for, and also, you know, sort of a UK report coming out in a slightly, you know, meant to be positive, but actually it could be read in quite a depressing way about sort of the economic benefit of international students to the UK more broadly, with the Northeast in particular, actually, you know, particularly benefiting from that sort of economic input. So I think, yeah, really quite I think on some level quite upsetting for us, certainly on an ethical level. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Fran's comment is quite interesting as well, for how the different levels of study actually, you know, how it might play out or kind of land differently in the different levels of study in different contexts, certainly in the UK context. And I'm sure Manchester colleagues who can relate to that as well, the sort of postgraduate taught, or what we call postgraduate taught sector, you know, master's programs are, I think it's no big secret, certainly in our university, Sam, that is the, I mean, I teach on a master's program, that we are referred to regularly in university committees as the cash cow of our faculty. That's just not even a big secret. And we are 98%, you know, overseas students. So yeah, it's an interesting one that, you know, can make us, yeah, we could ponder for hours, I suppose. So thank you, Fabienne, for sparking that that little discussion. Anybody else with any other questions for any of the presenters or any comments? I mean, colleagues, also feel free, obviously, to ask each other questions, you know, if you've got questions. Sylvie.
Well, I'll just come back on Fran's point, I think, about, you know, the competing logics and what can we possibly do about being stuck in this system, as I think is common in the US and the UK and Canada and Australia, and it sounds like in other European contexts as well. And I think from my pragmatic institutional aim to come out of this pilot study, which is going to take a bit more work apparently to ground it, is really basic. You know, in the UK we have these widening participation flags, which when undergraduates apply through the central admission system, they get a flag. Oh, hey, you went to a school that doesn't normally send lots of students to university. We'll take a second look at your application, even if your grades aren't that great. I just want to do the same thing for international students. I'm not even trying to upset the apple cart of the economic logic. I mean, I am, but that's a political project, and this is a much more achievable goal. I think it would be possible once we've got the right foundations, and I'm so grateful that Alina and Sam, you're doing this work and you're doing the quantitative work as well to go alongside it. Because to convince colleagues that this is grounded in research and facts, numbers are always a bit more institutionally convincing for whatever reason. So I think that is possible, and I think it's something we could work to embed into scholarship schemes, for example. It's just an awareness that there are globally intersecting systems of educational disadvantage. We know this, it's just not making it through into the admissions and decision-making spaces.
Thanks, Sylvia. I think that's such a good point, isn't it? I think I'm sure all of us are doing this research actually to make a practical impact as well, right? And I think it's so important to have work of this kind, because actually what we need is you know, empirically informed, evidence-based, right? Information, I suppose, because that's hopefully what will help you know, convince the powers to be. I mean, just thinking, Sam, from our project as well, we think, of course, a lot about some of these practical you know, implications as well, and just in terms of, certainly at Newcastle University, you know, support for international students. There isn't necessarily, so on the well-being side, for instance, it's excellent for just kind of generally for students, but it's not very nuanced. And we know we have, I mean, just anecdotally, I know that a lot of my international students really do struggle with asking for help, right? So because obviously cultural stigmas around mental health, all sorts of things. And so there's that side of things as well, where I think really kind of small shifts in the practices of individual higher education institutions and even academic departments could make such a difference. But hopefully that's where our research can kind of help you know, shift things. Any other thoughts or questions from anyone? You're sort of doing Sam and I's job already here by really, we've had the discussion, but I think Sam and I, we have a couple of backup comments that we can kind of just raise to close the symposium, if that's okay. So I think, Sam, should I start with my overall? We had a sort of overall reflection, I guess, which was simply that I think I guess our reason for asking all of our co-presenters here to come together was we're just really keen, and I think you all are as well, to really deconstruct this notion of the international student experience, because certainly in our institution, this label, I mean, frustrates me every single day I come to work. This label, international students, is used so uncritically, not by us on the call, obviously, but by and large, I would say, even in, in our institution, it isn't something that is kind of critically interrogated. It isn't looked at through a kind of more nuanced lens. That's just not happening. It's very much still international students are sort of one group, right? So we were hoping that by coming together, linking up with all of you, the kind of collective endeavor really is the sort of overarching goal, I guess, to really deconstruct what we mean by international students. And I think we've all done that really beautifully. So, starting with Fran looking at actually how nuanced the notion middle class is, and then, in Susanna's talk around issues around, languages and different varieties of one language, like Portuguese, for example, or perceptions we might have about international students' first languages. And then, of course, we had, I think, it's just, the talk that Sylvie, Thomas, Sarah, and Ray gave us, just terminologies. I mean, widening participation is, I think, one of many terms that we've just not really, I guess, researched or looked at from a kind of international global perspective. So that was my kind of overall point, I think. And Sam, did you want to add another quick couple of things maybe to bring it all together?
Thanks, Alina. Yeah, I think we've got 1 minute left. So I think just really following on from what Alina said, and all of our presenters have said so fantastically today. Just really that I think for us, just recognizing these multiple forms of inequality is absolutely key. We feel that it's an absolute matrix of those forms of inequality, and actually that has to be key to understanding and recognizing the cultural backgrounds of our students. We just think there's such significant differences, in financial, political, linguistic and cultural capital, and of course, that's all sort of, intersected with these sort of structural disadvantages, particularly around, for example, economic concerns, and we're really concerned about, ultimately some of these things leading to, our students just feeling quite marginalized, and actually that help not being available. So we really want to raise this point around sort of increasing intersectional consciousness, which I think really ties in really well with some of the work that you've done, Sylvie, Ray, Tom, Sarah, around sort of widening participation. We just really want to think about how do we highlight participants experiences, just recognizing the advantages that they may have, but equally, of course, their challenges, and actually how that's really going to shape their educational experiences and educational journeys.
Thanks, Sam. And I think, yeah, we'll bring it all to a close now, but just to say that we've enjoyed it immensely and really, really grateful for all the contributions and for everyone you make time, particularly if you're in a different time zone, like Fran, where it's getting quite late, I think. So we appreciate it very much. And I think also thank you to the audience, and we'll be in touch with all our co-presenters, because this all sounds like there's lots and lots of work still to be done. And we'll see some of you next week in Manchester, I believe. How exciting. So fabulous. Thanks, everyone. And I think we'll just bring it to a close. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, and conference. Great.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.